Hey there, I hope you're doing well. My name is Arya and today we're going to look at some more Reddit stories. If you enjoy Reddit stories, consider liking, subscribing, and maybe hitting that notification bell too. Let's get started with today's first story. Much love, everyone. Today's first story comes from cheating wife gets divorce papers at work. During my performance, we got hitched at 20. Both of us around a year later I decided to do the school thing again. To finish up my degree. Then we became parents and I started feeling the heat to wrap up that degree of mine. My kiddo just hit 2 years old when I kicked off my final year of college. 2 semesters were all I needed to nail it, so, in September of '93, my routine looked like this. I did a part-time gig from 3 in the morning till 7 stocking shelves at a store. Then a full-time gig desk job at the police department from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tuesday nights were school nights from 5:30 p.m. to 10, and I had school again on Saturdays, starting at 8 a.m. and ending by 2 p.m. Now my wife did the nurse's aide thing at the local hospital, clocking in from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Our little one was taken care of by my mom. The cool thing was everything school. Our jobs and even my parents was all super close by. I'm talking, no more than 10 minutes to get from one to the other. We had a darn good setup going on, making things work as best we could for what I was aiming to achieve. Right before day the weekend was a non-stop battle between us. It was spring of '94 finals week for me. If I could wrap up my papers and ace my finals by the upcoming Sunday, we'd be cheering for me, finishing up my bachelor's in science and finally getting out of this intense 8-month grind. However, she was mad because I wouldn't take a break from studying to take her and our kids somewhere. She'd been griping about my work and school for a while now, and it had gotten so bad that we hadn't been intimate for 2 months. On this specific Monday evening, I was double-checking a research paper I'd finished on Saturday, due on Tuesday evening, while she kept picking fights non-stop. Finally, I told her to shut up and quit acting childish. She stared at me and just blurted out, "I hate you and I'm in love with someone else." Bam, just like that. I was floored. We argued for about an hour until she spilled the beans about what went down earlier that day during her lunch break at work. Apparently, for the past 2 months, she'd been caught up in an emotional thing with a janitor at the hospital. Well, it all started with him giving her compliments and just being around whenever she turned her head. Then things went up a notch to them having lunch together in the cafeteria, and after that they began having regular sessions of badmouthing me to him. About 2 weeks ago, they took these complaint sessions to the car. She later admitted that during that time they kissed twice, but today things escalated to a fool and make-out session. It ended with her giving him a hand job while he was doing some stuff with his fingers, and they both went on about how much they loved each other. When she spilled this to me, I practically disconnected from reality. I mean, it's like I left this world for a moment. Later I'll delve into more details about what was going on in my head that night, but for now let me share what my wife wrote about that exact moment. It was weird when I told him about what we did. I was kind of ready for some sort of explosion, but he just looked at me with the most awful pain you can imagine. Then it turned into something I can't even put into words. It was like he went blank. He turned away and walked into the bedroom, quietly shutting the door. I remember getting furious. Then the jerk wouldn't even put up a fight for me, right? At that moment, I just felt like I'd made the right call and everything was going to somehow fall into place. I did it. I was finally breaking away from the guy who'd been ignoring me all these months. I walked back into the living room with a suitcase, walked past her and headed straight out the front door. I recall her asking over and over, "Where the hell do you think you're going?" "Running back to mommy's" was one of the things she threw at me. I set the suitcase down in the driveway, went back inside, grabbed her purse and held it out, telling her to leave. That caught her off guard. She refused, so I lifted her gently onto my shoulder, carried her out the door and set her on the car hood. Her surprise gave me the chance to dart back inside and lock the door. She tried to get in, but I held onto the deadbolt and eventually she left a crash at her parents' place. She let them know we were separating, but didn't say why. That was a hell of a night. I rang up both jobs to explain a family emergency had popped up and I wouldn't be making it in the next day. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. Update. I woke up at 7 and right away started figuring out how to cut down on contact with my Centebex STBX. I rang up my mom to ask her if she could look after my son. She was concerned since he'd usually be there. By that time, then I jotted down a list of things I needed to get done that day and I got cracking on the list. First, I dropped off my son and let my mom know I'd have to sit down and have a good talk with her later. After that, I swung by the office of a lawyer friend of the family. He'd known my dad from way back and I'd known him forever. I explained that I wanted to kick off the divorce process pronto. He heard me out and suggested I take some time to mull things over, but I was dead set. He said he could have the divorce papers done by the end of the day. I told him I'd come by to pick them up and then personally file them at the clerk's office handling stuff, like this was kind of my gig at work with the PD. Next, I went and got new locks for the house and made a pit stop at the bank. I cleared out and closed both our savings and checking accounts. I took half the money, put it in an envelope and swung by my sister-in-law's workplace. I handed her my wife's share of the cash. I told her to pass on the message to my wife, no contact with me whatsoever, and that money was her half from the bank. I also let her know I had gone ahead and canceled our only credit card back at my mom's place. If you're excited about this story, please let us know. If you enjoyed the video, please press A. If not, press 0. Your feedback has inspired me to collect more uplifting and meaningful stories. I spilled everything to her. She and my younger sister cooked up a plan. My sis would hang at my house and take care of my son. While I juggled work and school for the rest of the week, I headed home and swapped out the locks, spent the afternoon cleaning up and goofing around with my son, then headed off to school. Meanwhile, my wife decided to skip work that day. She got in touch with the janitor and laid out what had gone down. He was understanding and invited her over to his place that evening. To escape the stress, I'll give you more scoop on this place in a bit. Long story short, she went over and hooked up with him. Here's what she wrote about that night. He passed out afterward. I recall being all hyped up at first, but during and after it started to feel off with him asleep, my mind started wandering. I thought about, gee, that's me, and how he had kind of pushed me into this, made me go find someone else. I got up and left. On the drive home, memories of the first time G and I had sex came flooding back. We were each other's first. I totally lost it and just kept thinking about how disgusted I was with myself. Then I circled back to being mad at G all over again. It was like this twisted cycle. I just couldn't face up to how horribly messed up what I'd done was. I convinced myself it was his fault. Update. The day kicked off just like any other. I headed to work, then got back home, took a shower and had breakfast with my son and sister. My wife gave me a ring wanting to sort out plans to see our son. She had this arrogant and spiteful tone on the phone. I let her know I was going to meet her on Sunday at 1 p.m. and she could hang out with him at a nearby park, but she didn't want to. She was aiming for a weekend with him. I declined. She realized that having him stay at the house solved the whole babysitting issue. Both her folks were working, so she didn't push it further. She slammed the phone down. Off to work at the PD I went, and at my earliest chance I swung by the clerk's office and got the divorce paperwork filed. Later in the day, a gal I knew there gave me a heads up that they were ready to head to the sheriff's office to get served. I called up a deputy I was familiar with and laid out the story, asking him to serve the papers to her. While she was on the job, he agreed and said he'd do it the next day. Meanwhile, the STBX got back to work. Her janitor buddy swung by her spot and chatted her up throughout the day. Lunch wasn't doable that day, nor could they meet up in the evening. He claimed he had some commitment with one of his kids. He told my wife earlier on in the affair that he was divorced and had 3 kids after work. She headed to her parents' place later that night. She called me 3 times, and each time I hung up the moment I realized it was her caller ID. Wasn't all that common in those days around where I was update following another night of heavy grieving. My day kicked off just like the previous one. I headed to work. As I got to my second job, I got a call from the deputy who was set to serve the papers. He mentioned he'd be there around noon. I said that was fine. Her lunch break was scheduled from 11 a.m. to noon. I sat at my desk making an attempt to focus on work. I was restless, getting up and heading to the bathroom about 3 times before I eventually threw up. I had to talk myself down and constantly remind myself that I was doing the right thing. Luckily, my wife hadn't reached out to me so far. 11 a.m. My wife meets up with the janitor for lunch. They slip away to his car in the parking lot and engage in intimate activity, real classy. They clean up, return inside, and grab some food from the cafeteria for lunch. Noon. My wife heads back to the nurse's station on her hall, accompanied by the janitor. They strike up a conversation with the RN in charge of the hall. 5 minutes later, the deputy walks in. He inquires with the RN about Kay. My wife Kay speaks up saying, "That's me." The deputy turns to her and in a loud voice, declares, "Mrs. K, you're being sued for divorce due to infidelity." My wife collapses onto the floor. Here's how she described the moment when I heard that this huge wave of shame and guilt hit me. It sunk in that I had wrecked my marriage, that you was actually going to divorce me. Part of me foolishly, truly believed he wouldn't go through with it. I thought this was just another argument where I was trying to come out on top. It was some messed up thinking. Can recall the deputy physically lifting me and making me sit in the chair. There was screaming. It was coming from me. The RN was trying to calm me down. The janitor reached for my hand, and I ended up punching him. He turned his head, and my punch landed on his neck. I scratched him as he pulled away. I said. I was shouting at him, going on about how he had ruined my life. Eventually, they managed to calm me down. The deputy mentioned that the janitor took off right away. She got herself together and went back to her shift, but it did a lot to cover for her. At 2:45 p.m., my wife was nearing the end of her shift. When she got summoned to the hospital administrator's office, fear gripped her. She figured someone must have reported her meltdown when she walked in. The lady shut the door and wasted no time in telling her she was fired. She was instructed not to come back on the premise and that her final paycheck would be sent by mail. It turned out that someone had witnessed the rendezvous in the parking lot. They reported it at some point. I had been brought in and shared the story about the divorce papers. The janitor had been called in for questioning, fired and booted from the premises. Just an hour before my wife got fired, word had spread throughout the hospital. She mentioned she just got into her car and drove over to her parents. At this stage, her folks still had no clue what was going on, just that she and I had split up and things seemed pretty darn serious. At 5:30 p.m. I was having dinner with my son at home. My sister had gone out with her pals, so it was just us hanging out. The deputy had passed along the events from earlier and I got to say it felt pretty satisfying knowing the impact. The fact that the janitor happened to be there was just sheer luck. I was surprised my wife hadn't been arrested for laying hands on him, but well, you can't have everything. Then a knock came at the door. In front of me stood a lady who couldn't have been more than 5 feet tall, and she was incredibly pregnant. She could barely stand up straight. She asked for Kay. I explained that she no longer lived here and wasn't coming back. She asked if I was her husband. I replied, soon to be ex-husband. I'd served her the divorce papers. Earlier that day, she introduced herself as Dee, the janitor's wife, and revealed she was carrying their 4th child. I invited her in to take a seat. She went on to explain what had gone down earlier about her husband and my wife getting the boot and the whole messy situation. I felt like I might throw up. Who on earth was this crazy woman I had married? She also filled me in on the house where my wife had been meeting him at that moment. If I could have found him, I would have killed him without a second thought, not for my wife, but for the sake of humanity in general. This guy was a total piece of garbage. I'll tell you more about the house later. She asked me where my wife was, and I told her she was with her parents after she assured me that she only wanted to talk to her and reveal the truth. I gave her directions. My son was still at the table in his chair, visible from where we were sitting in the living room. She praised me for being a great dad handling the care of my son on my own. Then she got up and left at 6:30 p.m. My father-in-law answered the door and Dee asked to talk to my wife, thinking she was one of Kay's friends. He went and got Kay, who stepped out onto the porch to chat. Dee introduced herself and let Kay know she just wanted her to understand the truth about her situation with the janitor. Turns out Dee and the janitor were still married and living together. Dee was in the 8th month of pregnancy, expecting their 4th child. Kay was already upset, tears flowing, and she kept apologizing again and again, but things were about to get worse. You see, the janitor and another guy at the hospital, along with one of their buddies, were involved in a twisted game. Their goal was to see how many married women they could sleep with in just 90 days before my wife, the third guy, was in the lead with 3 conquests. My wife became the janitor's third, and the night he supposedly had something going on with one of his kids. He was actually with a 4th woman. Dee revealed that this lady he was with had been married for 25 years and Dee was planning to inform her husband. Next, it turned out she was their neighbor now about the house. It was a place they rented out to rendezvous with these women. Dee found out about this just 2 hours after he got fired. He came home high and crying and spilled everything, hoping to work things out. Dee left with the kids, telling my wife she was leaving him. Then she squared up her shoulders, slapped my wife hard across the face, and called her a dumb cow. Kay was in shock. Dee told her she ought to be ashamed of herself for throwing away her family. She told her how she had been at our place an hour ago watching a loving man feed his son all alone, because his wife was a stupid, selfish witch. My wife completely lost control and started crying while Dee walked away, got into the car and drove off. My in-laws checked on her once they heard the car pull away. She was pretty much in a daze. They brought her inside and were debating whether they should take her to the ER. When she started talking erratically, my father-in-law thought she might be on some sort of stimulant. She began rambling about how awful she was and how she needed to fix things. They eventually managed to calm her down and got the full story. My father-in-law was deeply hurt. He's always been a good man, and he mentioned later that my wife could see the shame and disappointment on his face. As for my mother-in-law, well, she followed her usual pattern and pointed the finger at me. I can't say I'm a fan of her right then, and their aftermath the day after my father-in-law reached out to me and said he was sorry. It was the only time I ever sensed there might be tears in his eyes. He filled me in on what had happened, explaining that Kay had been holed up in her room day and night. I mentioned the Sunday appointment I had arranged with Kay to meet at the park at 1. He agreed and hung up. I worked on Friday and attended school on Saturday by day's end. I got the news that I had passed and would be receiving my degree. It was a mix of emotions, but I had made it. My parents threw a celebration that night with extended family coming over for a barbecue. I'm fortunate to have a wonderful family. No one brought up Kay the following day. I didn't hear from Kay at 1 as planned. I took it as a stroke of luck, something I could use if there was a custody hearing down the line at 3:30. Her father called. He let me know that Kay still wasn't responding coherently, just wandering around in her bathrobe, with a notebook in her hands that she wouldn't let go of. She hadn't bathed in days and was barely eating. He was worried and exhausted. He even feared going to sleep in case she harmed herself. He asked me to come see her. I turned him down. I couldn't muster any feelings for her. I told him to get her professional help and that I would consider letting her see our son once she got herself back together. Honestly, I felt nothing for her. That initial night had tested me and I emerged stronger. I'll explain more later. I wasn't going to invest any care into her ever again. I didn't hear from her or her family for the next 2 weeks. Reconciliation. A couple of weeks had passed since my last conversation with my father-in-law. During that time I quit my part-time job and was actively hunting for a new one. My MBA plans were on hold as I aimed to settle into a new job. First, my son had been asking about his mother, and all I could do was reassure him. The longer she took to reach out to see him, the better it could be for my chances of securing a favorable custody arrangement. I was at the PD police department when she called asking to schedule a time to meet and see our son. I inquired if she had managed to compose herself enough not to frighten him, and she replied affirmatively. I arranged to meet her at 9 a.m. in the park on Saturday and requested that she bring her dad along. I didn't want to meet her alone, so my mother accompanied me upon seeing her. I felt confident that my decision to limit her contact to just 2 hours was the right one. She was in a bad state, noticeably thinner, no makeup, and smelling of ivory soap. None of those familiar feminine scents I associated with her later. I found out that her mother had bathed and dressed her. Wasn't fully functional, yet our park meetings continued for about 3 weeks and I eventually extended them to 4 hours, including Sundays. Her appearance improved each week, but I remained concerned about her mental well-being. Therefore, I refused to let our son stay overnight with her or see him alone. Eventually, my mother-in-law grew tired of this arrangement and decided to hire a lawyer to file for custody. Now Kay hadn't signed the divorce papers yet, and I was all right with that. After 6 months, I could file for divorce through the court anyway, but the custody lawsuit infuriated me because she was aiming for full custody. I had already discussed with her father that I was open to eventually working toward a 50-50 custody split, but her mother threw that out the window. In response, I counteracted with a request for full custody based on her mental state. Honestly, I was itching for a confrontation. I was furious and needed a way to release that pent-up anger. This was the opportunity on the day of the custody hearing. My lawyer informed me that her attorney had approached him with a request. Kay wanted to talk to me privately. I initially refused. He mentioned it might be an offer, so I relented but insisted it should be in the hallway outside the courtroom, where both attorneys could witness it but not hear the conversation. They agreed. She began with small talk. Asking about our son and how he was doing, I replied. He was great and improving daily. She asked about my schooling and I informed her I passed and would be graduating next week. She seemed pleased with that. Then she looked down and inquired if she could attend my graduation. I responded that my graduation was meant for my family and friends, and since she was neither, the answer was no. That hit her hard throughout most of our relationship. We had worked together diligently to achieve that goal. By saying no, I conveyed that she couldn't share in that accomplishment with me. She pleaded, but I held my ground and repeated my refusal. I added, it's special to me. It didn't matter enough to you when you let someone treat you like garbage. I was truly turning into quite fueled by the desire to hurt her. She welled up with tears, turned around and walked back to her lawyer. The hearing got underway. I testified nothing out of the ordinary. Then my mother-in-law stood up and blamed me for everything she claimed. I was seeing someone and driving my wife insane. No evidence of that, but truth was never her concern. She also alleged that I had assaulted my wife by grabbing and throwing her onto the car hood the night she left. Next was my wife's turn. Kay started responding to her attorney's questions but stopped after the third one. She asked the judge if she could speak up. He suggested she confer with her attorney first, but she declined. He granted her permission. Here's what my wife wrote in her notebook. I remember feeling so sad as the hearing started. I listened to G presenting his side of the story and how he'd taken care of J, our son, all these weeks. I needed to make things right sitting there. I knew my mom was lying to shield me, but it was just one more lie. On top of another. I'd had enough. I had to fix this. Kay then stated that she wanted to apologize to my parents, who were in the room. She also expressed remorse to her own parents. Looking at me, she acknowledged that I probably hated her more than anyone else. Right now. She admitted that everything that happened was her fault and that, at this point, she just wanted to salvage whatever was left of our shared history. even if it was just to reach a point where I could look at her without disgust. Then she turned to the judge and expressed her desire to retract her claim, stating that she would accept any custody arrangement I deemed appropriate. I conferred with my attorney and we proposed supervised 1-hour visits for 6 weeks, followed by weekends with him every other week, provided there were no issues. We adjourned. In hindsight, I think that's when I glimpsed a tiny hint of potential for us to be more civil to each other, not a reconciliation but at least a sense of mutual respect. The schedule worked well. By the 3rd week, our visitation time expanded to 3 or 4 hours, just the 3 of us, her, me, and our son. Although I wasn't exactly friendly, I relished observing my son enjoy his time with his mom. It was beneficial for them both. However, during the 5th visit there was a negative incident. She unexpectedly hugged my right arm from behind. While I was watching our son play, I panicked and yelled at her never to touch me again. She hugged our son and left in a hurry. The next week we acted as if nothing happened and she maintained her distance. Another month went by and we started discussing day-to-day matters more frequently. I had landed a new job with better pay and she had begun nursing school. She started confiding in me that the janitor was persistently calling her and wouldn't leave her alone. She claimed she wanted to be honest with me in case I heard something. Apparently she had asked him to stop bothering her, yet he still turned up at her parents' house. One evening her father-in-law even threatened to harm him if he didn't back off. I told her I no longer cared who she was involved with. She insisted she wasn't sleeping with anyone and wouldn't until she was sure our family could never be repaired. I bluntly stated that it was never going to happen. 6 months after our separation, I brought up the matter of her signing the divorce papers. She refused. I reminded her that I didn't necessarily need her signature, but it would be easier if she complied. She proposed coming over to the house that night to discuss it. She offered to sign the papers that night. If I still wanted a divorce, I agreed when she arrived. She had these notebooks, those little black composition books that looked like bound volumes. She told me she had begun jotting down thoughts the day after she received the divorce papers. She didn't exactly know why, but it seemed to provide some sort of solace. She told me she wrote down every single thing she could recall about what had occurred, delving into as much detail as she could muster. She wanted me to read it, but cautioned that it would hurt deeply in those writings. She detailed her interactions with the janitor, what she said and did. I wasn't eager to go through it. She acknowledged the risk she was taking, but she felt the need to help me understand why she was so determined to salvage our marriage. Reluctantly, I read it. She was right, it was tough. The physical aspect wasn't explicitly described, but the way she discussed me and our marriage in front of him, that cut to the bone. The account I read that night also chronicled her emotional breakdown. The writing was chaotic and disordered. Yet each day it improved bit by bit. Eventually, she started dissecting her actions and words, using it as her own form of therapy. One amusing part was when she recounted a bizarre notion she had, believing it would miraculously set things right. You see, she remembered she hadn't orgasmed with the guy, not even once in her mind. If she didn't climax, then it meant she didn't derive any pleasure from it. Therefore, she had done nothing wrong and I should take her back. She clung to that idea until she shared it with her dad, much to his discomfort, and he pointed out that it didn't work that way. Although reading her account didn't alter my decision, it did alarm me. I still had concerns about her mental state. Only after reading what she had written during those 2 weeks did I fully grasp the fragility of her mind. I agreed to give it more time, partly out of apprehension. This newfound courage in her led her to urge me to write to her, sit down, put together a letter or something detailing what had occurred. She believed it would give her insights into how to support me better. I considered this proposal. I recognized I was still in a messed up state, but maybe it could aid me in moving forward and perhaps maintaining some form of a healthy relationship later on. What she called her writing therapy gradually transformed into our method. We committed to meeting twice a week. Our initial task was to jot down our perceptions of our marriage's state before day during our meetings. We'd exchange our letters and take notes. Then we'd put our queries in writing and pose them to each other. We'd converse until each question was thoroughly addressed before moving on to the next. If we didn't complete everything, we'd continue during the next session. The guidelines were simple: be truthful. No yelling and no avoiding any questions. Our journey began with assessing our pre-day relationship, and we progressed through each subsequent day. Until the Sunday I conversed with her father after she received the divorce papers. Beyond that, we planned to reassess and proceed accordingly. I have to admit, I acted quite terribly throughout this process. I provided honest answers to questions, except for one, more on that later. However, I used it as an opportunity to embarrass her. I made her repeatedly recount hurtful things she had said to him about me. I pushed her to share explicit details about the physical encounters. She hesitated at times, but she ultimately followed through. Although it was comparatively mild compared to what we once shared, it stung truthfully. I believed I could handle it because I genuinely wasn't interested in rekindling the relationship. Yet hearing it was painful. It's astonishing how unkind I had grown, though in my mind it felt justified back then. About a month into this process, I had to admit it was somewhat beneficial for me. She suggested the idea of moving back in and trying the next phase. I declined. She pleaded and presented a compelling case, but I stood firm. Even if I considered reconciliation, I couldn't imagine being intimate with her again. She understood and even proposed that I could seek outside companionship while she remained faithful. That's not something I would be comfortable with, so I declined. Another month passed and I finally relented, but I established firm, non-negotiable rules for the path ahead. First, she had to sleep in the spare room. Second, absolutely no physical contact whatsoever. Third, she kept her money in her checking account, but I handled her banking and provided her with checks for bills, rent, for the room expenses, and some spending money. This was because she had given the janitor $300 from our savings account a week before day. Also, I thought she might say no and not move in. Fourth, her mother wasn't allowed into my home unless we decided to reconcile. I was still mad at her. Still am a bit. Fifth, all previous custody agreements would automatically resume if we didn't reconcile. Sixth, if I started seeing someone else, she had a week to find another place to stay. She agreed and moved back in. It was tougher than I anticipated. There was no longer that cooling-off period between the times I saw her. She was there all the time. I picked fights over small things constantly and said hurtful things to her. I wanted her out almost as soon as she moved back in. I needed a solution. So we started having what we called Thursday night fight night. This came from our meetings where we were writing things down. Every Thursday night after our child was asleep, we'd sit in the living room and discuss ongoing issues or arguments. They had to be resolved on Thursday night before going to bed and couldn't be carried forward. We actually still have a version of this today. It evolved into simply asking during dinner if there's anything we need to discuss that night. The kids never knew where it originated or what it was. I was still being difficult. I threw her affair in her face at every opportunity. She handled it calmly and never engaged when it escalated. To that point, I'd say I was emotionally abusive towards her. However, she was strong. She believed we were meant to be together and that since she had wrecked our lives, she had to rebuild it on her own. Until I saw things her way and joined her, she was dedicated to giving me the time I needed. 6 months after she moved back in, I had my own breakthrough. After a particularly rough day, with constant triggers, I locked myself in the bedroom. I just couldn't handle it anymore. My wife came to the door and knocked quietly, saying, "You need to talk. I'll be out here whenever you're ready." I heard her slide down the door, sit on the floor and lean against it. She stayed there for an hour. It was nearly midnight when I finally opened the door. She asked if she could come in and I said no, suggesting we go to her room. We sat, she on the bed, me in a chair, and I finally opened up about what happened after I asked her to leave on the night I learned about the affair. Let's rewind to the evening of day after she drove away. I spent a lot of time in my son's room just watching him sleep. I went to my desk, grabbed the checkbook and bill ledger, and took them along with a copy of the life insurance policy, placing them in plain view on the kitchen table. I took a shower and then entered the bedroom, retrieving my piece from the closet shelf and placing it on the bed. I dressed in jeans, a button-down shirt, and even tucked in my shirt tail. I combed my hair and sat on the bed holding the barrel of the piece in my mouth. I tasted the oil on it, which I had strangely fixated on. It tasted exactly as it smelled. I have no idea how long I sat there. Eventually, I unloaded it, put it away, undressed, and went to bed. Unfortunately, I think many betrayed spouses have thoughts like this. At some point, I told her. That was the one thing I hadn't shared during our recovery. For the first time, I allowed her to hug and kiss me on the forehead, not as a farewell, but in a different way. It was the first emotional connection I permitted. I confessed that I forgave her that night, even though I didn't truly mean it. Then it was months later before I genuinely forgave her, but expressing those words started to open a door for me. Following that, physical touch gradually increased, holding hands, quick kisses, hugs. These became more common in our interactions. Sex wasn't happening yet, but we were moving in that direction. Finally, almost a year after she moved back in, we became intimate. I think of this as our time of hysterical bonding. She continued journaling and, according to her, we had sex 32 times in 28 days years later. In a conversation, she shared that until that night she woke up every morning thinking it might be our last day together. She kept telling herself to just hold on for one more day. She knew me well enough to understand that sex meant I was reconnecting emotionally today. Our marriage is strong. We've both succeeded in our careers and raised 3 grown children to our knowledge. They are unaware of any of this. We don't plan to tell them, but we won't lie if they ask. We've undergone significant changes. My wife is much stronger and wiser. Now she views this as an unnecessary evil she caused, but one she triumphed over. Sometimes I think she still holds herself accountable. For my part, this topic doesn't surface in our discussions or arguments anymore. It hasn't in over 20 years. She's perceptive and often senses when I'm triggered, which still happens occasionally, maybe once or twice a year. These moments are swift but stinging. Her response is comforting. She'll hold my hand, hug me, and say I love you or thank you. I've lost some of my inner goodness. I tend to keep my feelings to myself and handle them on my own. While I support her emotionally, I've made it clear, I won't be her emotional crutch anymore. It's her responsibility to communicate the issue and propose a solution which I'll help execute. I love her. Learning to love her again was a process. It's different now, more realistic, yet still intense. Like I mentioned earlier, I believe I had to relinquish a part of my goodness for her to become a better person at this stage of my life. I'm content with that. I hope sharing this can help someone. Every situation is unique, but this approach worked for us and I'm grateful for it. I'm not advocating for reconciliation, I'm advocating for self-care. Focus on what you can control, not what you can't prioritize. What benefits you in your circumstance? It's okay to be a bit selfish, then consider working towards becoming a united we in your relationship or marriage down the line. Look up the Serenity Prayer. Its words are profoundly true in my opinion, and remember, this forum showcases the darkest days of our lives and marriages. Despite this tragedy, we've created numerous joyful memories that far outweigh it. I wish you all the best on this journey. You can come out victorious on the other side of pain. If you invest effort in yourself. Update, it's pretty unbelievable how long ago I posted this. I took a break from this account because I got a lot of negative comments privately from people strongly against reconciliation. I understand where they're coming from. Many who reached out for advice after my post were quickly told that I don't really recommend reconciliation. It's tough. It's challenging, it's painful, but if you can make it work under the right circumstances, it has its own rewards. I just wanted to update everyone that we're still married. We've now become grandparents, and if you've experienced that, you know it's a different kind of love altogether. My wife is partially retired now and does PRN work, meaning she works when needed and when she wants to. I'm still working full-time, but we managed to find plenty of time for traveling. I can't recall the last time I had a trigger, maybe around 3 years ago. It happened because our oldest child found out about my wife's affair through a spiteful relative who leads a rather lonely life. My wife handled the situation with grace and humility, and it seemed to impact me in a way that finally allowed me to move on completely. She apologized for the pain she caused me, and we both agreed that it was in the past, and if our child had any issues with it, we'd support him. But we also cautioned that, ultimately, it was a matter between us and fell under the category of our business. Thankfully, it doesn't seem to have negatively affected their relationship, although she was quite embarrassed about it. That's about all there is to share to all of you experiencing this painful journey. We wish you the best. Update 6 years later, got some sad news to share about me and my family. Just 3 weeks ago, my former wayward wife passed away. She fought colon cancer for half a year and eventually left us, with all of us there right by her side in the home we built 4 years ago, the place we had planned to enjoy our retirement in. It's tough to explain the loss. It's like nothing I've ever felt before, even comparing it to the pain we all felt as betrayed loved ones in this community in the years after our reconciliation. She spent her time making amends for the hurt she caused, and she succeeded in a big way. I really miss her, and our kids do too, but the thing is, I'm still here for a reason. In her final days, she wrote a letter to me. She asked our pastor to give it to me after the funeral when he thought it was right. I read it 3 days back, and there's a part from that letter that I want to share with all of you who have read our story and found something good in it. It shows how important it is for both the betrayed to forgive and for those who messed up to face the consequences of their betrayal, even when they're truly sorry. Right now, I'm in a lot of physical pain, as you know, but my faith helps me see what's ahead, and if the pain gets a bit lighter, pain can make you turn inward. In these past weeks, I've been doing a lot of soul searching. Sometimes I feel like I deserve the pain because of what I did to you. What I did to us so many years ago, but then you lift me up and help me sit in my chair. You feed me, you bathe me, you hold my hand, you play your guitar while I lose myself in memories. It's clear to me now that this pain is a gift. It's letting me experience the purest form of love, your real forgiveness, for what I did, because only true love and forgiveness show in your actions as you care for me. I love you so much. I'm going to turn this one over to you. What do you make of this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, a huge thank you from the bottom of my heart for getting involved in today's stories. Your love, support, and time mean the world to me. So, thank you so much for being part of this. I really appreciate your time. I'll see you in the next one. Take care and much love.